Today is Friday, January 19th, 2024, and you have found the Living Youth Podcast. I'm here, as usual, with my broadcast partner, Mr. Wallace Smith. Mr. Smith, how are we doing here in the middle of January?
Pretty good. We had kind of a cold snap, but it's supposed to be warming up. My wife's disappointed. She wanted a colder winter, I think, but I'm happy to see more comfortable weather.
You know, I remember the time, this is probably almost 10 years ago, and it was maybe going to snow in Charlotte, and Dr. Scott Winnell, I think he was doing the song leading that day, and he wanted to snow, but he knew others didn't want snow, and so some were praying that they wouldn't get snow, and he said some were praying they would get snow. He said it'd be interesting to see who got answers. That was such an interesting way of putting it.
That's funny.
I'm glad that I live in the South and that the cold snaps are still pretty manageable.
Right. Me too.
Okay, what do we have going on today for our podcast listeners?
Well, today we've definitely had a more somber focus this week in Charlotte, and so we've been to some of us, two funerals this week. And Mr. Robinson and I had talked about it, and we thought, there's a verse where Paul talks about how those who know the truth, those in the faith, don't grieve in the same way that others do. And so we thought, you know what? Maybe this would be a good time for our teens and young adults to talk about what that means and what does it mean not to grieve as others do. So that's our topic today.
Sounds great and timely. Let's do it.
Let's do that. Thank you, Jake and Julia. And here we are in Charlotte, North Carolina, and it's been an interesting week. I know we had a TWP this weekend, Mr. Robinson. It was great to see Mr. Ryan Dawson, Mr. Joe Brown, and their families, and all the wonderful folks in Florida. Just so you know, if you happen to be listening in Florida, it was fantastic for me to be out there with you guys and to do that TWP. And we pray that the follow-up is really, really good this weekend.
So you're saying they're out there doing the work and getting after it?
Getting after it in Florida, absolutely. So good on them and good on you guys there in Florida. But anyway, it just so happened we were there. For those who, and if you've been listening to announcements, then you're aware we had two faithful workers here at headquarters who have died recently. We had Mr. Galen Bonjour, who worked in the mail processing department, and we had Mr. Tom Turner, who worked at Risk and Legal. And anyway, to have both of them in such short order, we had funerals Monday and Tuesday, and because Mr. Turner's funeral was in Florida, and we were also already in Florida, then we were able to go to that. And both of them appreciated and dearly missed, and we look forward to seeing them again. And so we've been talking about that since as the week has gone on, and we've had such things on our minds. And so it did cross our minds to possibly that it might be beneficial to explain this verse, not just to explain it, but to talk about it and help to understand what it really means, because I have heard some question what this passage means before. And, if you're young, I know this is going to sound like a really morbid thought, but you have many funerals in your future. The people, this life is temporary. Until Jesus Christ comes and makes it permanent, this life is temporary. And as you get older, it sometimes seems like you have more funerals then, only because they start happening more quickly.
The first sign I was getting older is when my life transitioned from going to lots of weddings to starting to have some funerals show up.
Really? Interesting.
Now, of course, weddings, more funerals.
Yeah, it's more like the ratio starts to change a little bit. Well, and plus it's a little different too, because increasingly as you get older, the people who die are people closer to you. And when you're young, there's older relatives. And I remember the first funeral I ever went to in my life was a great uncle, and I didn't know him well because he was in a different state, but I did know of him, and definitely he was my grandmother's brother. But oh boy, it really impacted me. I'd never even seen someone not alive before, and that was just as a kid. It was really difficult. But the Bible has a verse about that, about how we react to death, and how it's different for us than it is for others. And so what we thought we would do for this podcast is to talk with you out there, our teens and young adults, and to read that passage and then to kind of elaborate why that is. And even though it's kind of funny, I've got the whole passage written here. We really don't need the whole passage. The part we want is really right in one small portion. Yet at the same time, The whole passage does provide helpful context, and it's just one of my favorite passages in the whole Bible. In fact, there's a piece of music. There's a John W. Peterson song based on just this passage, and I've had the privilege to direct that in a choir, and Mr. McNair has directed it here, and I love it. So it's in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, and we're going to read 1 Thessalonians 4, verses 13 through 18. So in the New King James, and I'll look at another translation in just a bit, it reads here in the New King James, 1 Thessalonians 4, 13 through 18, Paul writes, "But I do not want you to be ignorant, brethren, concerning those who have fallen asleep, lest you sorrow as others who have no hope. For if we believe that Jesus died and rose again, even so God will bring with him those who sleep in Jesus. For this we say to you by the word of the Lord, that we who are alive and remain until the coming of the Lord will by no means precede those who are asleep. For the Lord himself will descend from heaven with a shout, with the voice of an archangel, and with the trumpet of God, and the dead in Christ will rise first. Then we who are alive and remain shall be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air. And thus we shall always be with the Lord. Therefore, comfort one another with these words." It's a beautiful, beautiful passage.
As Mr. O'Gwen often said, there's an awful lot packed in there.
Oh, there is.
So, I read this, Mr. Smith, by the way, irony alert. And so is this describing going to heaven? What's happening here?
No, it is not.
Are the saints rising into heaven? What's happening here?
It says we're rising in the air. And, it's funny, you mentioned that, but Mr. Wesson has said it, others have said it, and I've experienced it myself. One of the most consistent questions we get in TWPs is about the quote-unquote rapture. And people will see this verse and think it's a rapture, and we don't want to get distracted for this podcast, but the Bible is plain when this happens. If you look at what Paul says to the Corinthians, it happens at the last trumpet. That's the seventh trumpet. It's not the first one. It's not the other ones. It's the last trumpet. So we're literally talking here about the resurrection to glory and the meeting Christ in the air, literally during the time of his return, not years before, but in those final sequence of days. So no, Mr. Robinson, I hope I didn't confuse you. It's not heaven.
Thank you for clarifying that, Mr. Smith. So you wanted to read this because we're, say, edified to not grieve as others do, which if you're a longtime church member, I immediately that resonates with me. But why is this different? How is this a distinctive for those of us in the Church of God? Because when you were reading it to me, I noticed right away something Paul says that would be easy to kind of read over. He describes those who are dead as having fallen asleep. And we just assume that. Okay, and that brings us comfort. Now, why do I say that?
Now, when you say that, let me make sure I'm clear, or that I understand. You're drawing a contrast between those of us in the church and those outside. Is that what we're doing? Okay.
Yeah. My brother-in-law, Sean Dumas, I got a waiver from him to tell the story. He was fine with me telling the story.
Okay, good.
But something really hit him, and then when he shared the story with me, it hit me. Though I wasn't there and didn't have the experience, it hit me as well, and made me realize how much I take for granted the church's doctrine of the resurrection and how much peace that brings to us. Because when somebody dies, we, especially if we're close to them, we will miss them. We're not saying there's no grief at all. But it's not the way that many in the rest of the world grieve. And why is that? Well, this story he told me, that's not a story, this is real life.
Because you grew up in the church, but he did not.
But he did not, right? And so he grew up in Florida. He went to high school in Florida. He grew up in Florida, and in high school is where he met his future wife. She was in the church. In fact, her dad was the pastor there in Gainesville. And so he grew up Catholic. And so when he was 17 or 18, he started having all these questions, went to the priests and all the people that should have answers. And they didn't. They had unsatisfactory answers. Okay. So then you fast forward a few years, they've moved to Austin. I had moved to Austin. I met Audrey and married her. That's Sean Dumas' sister-in-law. And a member of their family died. Grandpa died. We'll just call him Grandpa Joe.
Okay.
For anonymity. and he had died, and so they flew back to Florida for the funeral. And this is what struck Sean: the different thoughts about where Grandpa Joe was, because they were Catholic. So it was a mix of things. So he said to those where Grandpa Joe was relatively nice to them, they went ahead and gave him the benefit of the doubt, assumed he was in heaven. Now, if you know anything about Catholic doctrine, if you're not a good person, I think there's I'm exaggerating for effect here, 27 levels you could be in of various, from limbo to torment, okay?
It was definitely a purgatory, right?
So, bluntly, there were some of the family that assumed he was in a fiery torment somewhere down wherever that is. I don't know Catholic doctrine that well. And there were some who weren't even Catholic anymore who they didn't, I don't know, we don't know where he is. But there was a few, and this is what caught my attention when he told the story, that, man, if he's down in fiery torment, then they were grieved by that, to think that that's where he is. But the other thing that Sean pointed out to me was also that he has no hope. There's no future for him. He has his future and his reward. And so all these things stacked up, when you compare them to the church's doctrine and truth, those don't match up. But for everybody else out there, all those, even if you go take a more Protestant take, it gets real simple. You either die and go to heaven, or you die and go into Hades. Well, Hades, I guess, is actually a grave, isn't it? But, a fiery hell torment, okay? And those people that don't have the truth as the way we do grieve more than we do, because it's either you actually don't know where this person is, or you think they're in heaven, and so maybe that's a better thought, or they're in eternal torment, and that does not bring satisfaction or closure, and you're worried about, especially if you were maybe close to them. So anyway, he came back and was really struck by how our understanding of the doctrine of the resurrection, what truly happens when you die, brings us a peace that other people in the world don't have. We do not grieve as others do because we understand what's going to happen. They fall asleep. Nobody's in eternal torment. They're not even aware of the passage of time. Other scriptures bring that out. And they'll be resurrected to judgment, and either they just didn't understand anything and they'll have their first opportunity to hear the truth, or like Mr. Turner and Mr. Bonjour, they died with their boots on, as it were, in the faith, working hard. And we believe they're you kind of, if I could put it this way, you move to the front of the line when that seventh trumpet blows and Christ returns, they'll be resurrected into a new eternal body. I mean, that is a wonderful thing. Like, so for us, ironically, death can actually feel like good. They've run their race. Their next moments in life the pain will be gone. It'll be joy and peace, and then that peace that gives us, so we don't grieve as others do.
Right. I appreciate your telling the Mr. Sean Dumas story there. I have some similar ones to my rearing outside of the church, but not quite the same. I remember when my father's father died, my paternal grandfather. Just broke my heart. Loved him very much. He was a good grandfather, and was actually an elder in the church I attended before I knew the truth. And a man of just respected by the community, is really a name I feel a bit of a burden to carry on. But he, I remember I can't remember how old I was, but I was single digit age, I believe. And the pastor of our church that we attend, again, not the church, but the church that I attended before I understood anything, he was a very nice guy. And everything that I'm about to say, I don't mean to knock him at all. He remembered me when I saw him at my grandmother's funeral sometime later. I mean, I was really impressed. But I remember talking with him, and my grandfather loved to garden. And so I believed in that when you die, you had a soul that went to heaven for eternity, or, you went to hell, the flames of hell for eternity. And that's definitely what the church I attended taught. I remember hearing a sermon about Lazarus and the rich man, supposedly, that didn't treat it like a parable, but like a real story.
Right.
And as a kid, I remember hearing the minister explain that, and that rich man is still burning today.
Oh,
he
wow.
is still in agony. And as a kid, that freaked me out.
If I could insert one thing here that I found interesting, that So when I was at my old job, which I was at that job for about 12 years, so I got to know my coworkers really quite well, and they knew that I had some different beliefs. And
Right.
so we'd have conversations occasionally about religious things.
Mm-hmm.
And also, so I had some clients that we would talk about those things. And so here's what was fascinating. You could actually pretty comfortably talk about things like the Sabbath and other things like that, and they were interested in. And I never tried to make them feel bad, like, "Are you heathen? You know Sunday is a pagan day." Nothing like that.
Right.
But there were two things, and I have to see if I can remember what the second thing was, that they would almost start to get riled up on, and don't tell me this isn't the doctrine. And one of them was that the wicked don't burn eternally in hellfire. Don't tell them that's what happens to the wicked. And I was just stunned by that, because to me that sounds, this is not a new thought. That sounds nothing like a loving, merciful God, that somebody would be in eternal agony.
It's funny you say that. It's my understanding. I could be wrong, but having done the telecast for some time, if I recall, and this might just be based on anecdotes, that is one of the doctrines that gets us kicked off stations, especially when it's religious stations, fairly quickly. And I have known new people that are starting to embrace the truth and the doctrines they learn, but then they run up against the fact that the wicked are not eternally suffering forever, and it is difficult. And it's funny, I think it was you recently who brought up certain terrible things that various governments have done over the years to their people and to prisoners of war. And I did that. I wouldn't wish that on my worst enemy.
Right.
And yet, but they're okay with God deciding, that that's what He would do even worse, and for billions of years, really all eternity. So, absolutely. So that was a scary thing. But when it comes to my grandfather, I definitely did think that's where he was going. I figured he's going to heaven, but I didn't really know anything about heaven. What does that even mean? And so I remember talking to the pastor as I was a young, single-digit age. And because my grandfather liked to garden, I remember saying something, because you kind of feel like in the moment you're trying to show your maturity or your bravery and trying to, encouragement. And so I remember telling him why, I bet Pawpaw, of course, we all have our names for our grandparents. I called mine Pawpaw, but I bet Pawpaw's already got his garden going now in heaven, And I remember the pastor liked that. And of course, if I heard a little kid say something like that, I'd probably use it in the sermon too, if I believed like he did. And so I think he used that in his funeral message. I talked to little Wally, and he said this. But I don't want to hold this against him, because he was just trying to be encouraging and such. But at the same time, even as a little kid, I thought to myself, well, man, I just made that up. I don't really know. I don't know that's what he's doing. And what really in the Bible helps me to know that's what he's doing. There's because the church was, it thought, very Bible focused. So even as a little kid, I felt like it had to be what the Bible said. That's what the truth would be. And so I realize it's because some will say, well, no, I don't grieve as others do, because I know that my loved one's in heaven. But yet at the same time, the anchor of what they have is really vague. It's not actually all that strong, and that's a theme that I want to return to before we wrap up today. Is that it's not just a matter of having a vague idea. That the stronger our sense of our future hope is, to that degree, our grief is transformed and is different. And I want actually, we keep saying grief instead of sorrow, but there's a translation I do like on occasion that uses it that way. If you haven't picked up we read this whole long verse, but the part we're really focused on is that passage, the part where Paul says at the beginning of that passage, he says, "Lest you sorrow as others who have no hope."
Right.
Because there were people they had known, and especially if you put the context then, when the church was still realizing some details of God's plan, that it wasn't going to happen immediately, that is going to happen in the future, that as we know now, 2,000 years into the future even. So they have those who've believed, and then they see them dying. They see them not being alive, and Christ hasn't returned yet. And he's trying to explain to them that, don't fall into the trap where you're sorrowing in the same way as others do. Our hope is transformative. We don't have to sorrow in the same way that others do. And the English Standard Version, which it's not a perfect, none of these are perfect translations. I prefer the New King James Version, but I like that they put it kind of plainly too, and they use the word grieve. In the English Standard Version, it says that you may not grieve as others do, who have no hope. And while we'll focus here on why we don't grieve in the same way, I've actually heard some struggle with this, not many, but it's worth bringing up, with the idea that maybe you shouldn't grieve. Like maybe it's like, oh, good, joyous day. My loved one is finally dead and not with me anymore, but that means they're preserved. Well, it does mean, and maybe we'll look at that verse in the Psalms when it says how, when the righteous die, no one considers the fact that now they're safe from the things to come, and their future is sealed, and they're waiting for that in a sense. However, there can be a sense of, well, maybe I shouldn't feel, I shouldn't grieve at all. And even you'll have non-believers who will mock believers sometimes, saying, well, I don't even say why you're sad. You ought to be happy. You ought to be happy. Well, no, that doesn't seem to fit either. And what Paul is not saying here is that we shouldn't grieve at all. I mean, the idea that if whether a parent or a child or a grandparent or a close friend, that someone dies, the idea that you would not grieve is not the way God designed us. And I know Mr. Robinson has some interesting facts about that. We are going to grieve at times. In fact, Ecclesiastes chapter 3, I'm kind of prepped to read out of chapter 7, but Ecclesiastes chapter 3 and verse 4 says very plainly that there is a time to weep, just like there's a time to laugh, and there is a time to mourn, just like there is a time to dance. So the passage is not saying we don't grieve, just like the heathen do. They grieve, but we don't grieve. He's not saying that at all. He's saying we don't grieve in the same way that they do. And Mr. Robinson, I was just fascinated by the things that you were mentioning. We talked about them more yesterday concerning why we grieve and what's going on in the brain. And is this a good time to talk about that?
Well, I have two thoughts.
Oh, sure.
One, I would like to comment on your other translation that talks about having no hope.
Oh, right.
But it's funny though when you were going through that and saying some make fun of others for grieving. Why are you grieving? Like that is baked into us. That is biological.
Right.
Nobody does not have any grief. I mean, you could actually be the toughest guy ever who doesn't care about anything, and if you have any attachment at all to a person, you will have at least some level of grief.
Right.
That's just a fact. But the other thing I was thinking of when you talked about others who have no hope, kind of dovetailing here off the Catholic example. I mean, for 1,000 years through the Middle Ages, Catholicism was the unchallenged religion of Europe and being spread around the world. And if you were viewed as a bad person, like for example, if you committed suicide, that was automatically you were going to be in hell, in the fiery torment.
My mother thought that. I remember her explaining to me once in the car. She thought, oh, that was the worst sin ever, which she doesn't know. My mother was not in the truth. She had no idea. But she said, oh, yeah, and she definitely believed in hell. And she said, yeah, if that happens, you go straight to hell. But it's interesting. Eventually, one of my other great uncles, who had been a German in World War II and was just traumatized by what he saw in his country, during that time, he had turned into an atheist after World War II and eventually did kill himself. In his old age. Uh-huh. And I never heard my mother say that again after that, because she had this strong conviction, but then it was confronted with the idea that, well, I guess Uncle Joe is in hell. I'll just call him that, that he's in hell. Yeah. And I personally think she just couldn't reconcile those things.
That's fascinating. Okay. Well, the point I was going to make is, there was, I'm exaggerating for effect here a little bit. There's 101 ways you could have been a bad person and ended up in a fiery torment. In other words, you have no hope. Like Catholic doctrine means a set of people who die don't have a future. That was the other thing that Sean noted. But that, like, you have no hope. The hope that we have is easy to take for granted, and much of the world doesn't have a lot of hope. If you're an atheist, if you truly are an atheist, which I don't believe there's that many real atheists, you die and that's it. You have no hope. Like so many things, the end result is like you have no hope, other than this vague idea of heaven or nirvana, which doesn't even sound that attractive to a lot of people. Like we talked about on the other podcast, referring to another podcast that was talking about how heaven doesn't seem like very much fun. And so even that's the idea that you would be at peace is great, but like that doesn't sound like much of an adventure in life. So,
Right.
Satan's done such a great job of deceiving humanity and trying to make us discourage us and feel like
Right. I had someone. I understand how you meant that, because I would say the same way. But someone did say, "Well, I just don't like it when you say Satan did a good job or a great job." And say he did a thorough job. And I was like, okay, I'll say he did a thorough job. I'm definitely not praising the job he did, but an absolutely thorough job to make the afterlife, quote unquote, something that you wouldn't even. Why would I be interested in that? I don't see what's interesting about that. And it's part of our job and part of our task. And we'll talk about that, I think, a little more in the podcast to make it more real, because it is actually the greatest adventure of all.
Okay, so we've quoted him before. It's Dr. Andrew Huberman. He's a professor of ophthalmology and neurology. I'm rusty on.
He's definitely a
his title.
neuroscientist for sure.
Like he knows the way the brain works and the circuits and everything, and as they're connected to your eyes, which by the way he says that is a part of your brain. He said there's 2 intracranial holes where your brain pokes out in the form of
the eyes. Wow, it's fascinating.
And so that is fascinating. Okay. They've actually really mapped this quite clearly. They understand the grief circuits.
Mapping how grief works in the brain.
So I had to add a little bit of pretext to his comments here so that they made sense, because this is taken from a transcript where he discusses this, so that it will make sense to you out there listening to this. So he's talking about when there is a death, we have our body maps things, and so we have attachments, maps of attachments. You maybe even heard of attachment styles of children when they're young. And then he goes on to talk about how our brain repurposes our childhood attachment styles and maps them onto our adult relationships, but it's not as clean as you think. So I'm already off in the weeds. So he points out, maybe you're a girl and you had a really good attachment style with your father. You would think maybe that automatically means you're going to have a good when you get married and have a husband, that'll map on there, but it doesn't quite work that way. The mom's influence matters more on that too.
Oh, it's interesting.
So, yeah, it's interesting.
Let me paraphrase what you just said, kind of how I'd understand that. See, it and how I would think that fits with God, even that makes those formative years when you're working with a child so crucial, because they are really learning how the world works and how all their relationships are supposed to be, and the brain is actually shaping itself according to that learning, which to me also goes well with what Mr. Jonathan McNair, I've mentioned him before, saying this way back at a camp, that when Paul is telling Timothy, treat the old men like fathers, the women like mothers, that God is using those early relationships in the family to teach you how to relate to everybody.
Yes. We really do, I think, underestimate at times how critical childhood is to preparing you for adulthood. And I know on one level that's obvious, but at the same time, I think not as obvious as it.
Some of those things, the more you dive in, you realize, oh wow, there's so much more than I thought.
Yeah.
So it sounds like, but you're talking about physical brain structures even.
Yeah. So let's just say, for the sake of this explanation, that you're an adult. Okay.
Thank you for that.
Okay. So you have your brain maps out your relationships.
Okay.
And so you have this map structured about your relationships. So he says what happens. So when death occurs, it's about restructuring this map. And then he goes on to say, think of it like a tripod. It has 3 pieces. 1, space. Where are they? So when there's a death, space, where are they?
So there's people you have a relationship with. Mm-hmm. So if you have a relationship with someone, one of the things it's keeping track of is space. Where is that person located?
Well, he'll elaborate on it more.
Okay.
The 3 are space, time, and closeness.
Okay.
And so I did a little note so that I would have a shorthand for myself here.
Got it.
Time, when will I see them again? And closeness is like kind of attachment level. How close were you with them? So here's what he says. When someone dies, it's very confusing for the brain, because where are they in space? Where are they physically? Well, the body's put someplace. Maybe it's cremated, maybe it's not. We have notions of a spirit, and that depends on one's orientation, a soul or a spirit. Okay, if you don't, and he means have a spiritual orientation.
You're reading the transcript, right? If he doesn't, if you don't have that, okay.
Then you do. Okay, if you don't have a spiritual orientation, then you don't know where they go, right? So I think that kind of goes back to our Catholic thought. Even though they have doctrines about it, where is Grandpa Joe? Don't know for sure. So that adds to the grief level. And then time. When will you see them again? Then there's the never. You will never see them again. And the closeness component remains. And so there's an untethering of this map. So there's been brain imaging studies showing that if you look in the brain and people that are in grief from loss of a really strong attachment, the state of the brain and body that gets flipped on is a motivational state. And I remember the first time I heard him say that, I was like, this sounds like being motivated is like the last thing that you're feeling like when you've had the loss of a very close person. He says it's exactly the same circuitry in the brain that one sees active if someone very hungry is put just outside the wall of some delicious food. And he goes on to have some other examples about animals who are in different states and they're near something they desperately want to get to, but there's a barrier. And he says it's actually hard to watch because they'll actually start to hurt themselves trying to get through the barrier
to get to it.
The thing they want. So let's just say, for the sake, just to make it easy, you're married, longer, shorter, but whatever. You have a very, very strong attachment style to your mate. They die. Well, we can kind of understand where they are, but let's say you don't have the understanding of the resurrection. When will I see them again? Well, if you have no hope, you're never going to see them again. So that's like a difficult thing to deal with. But either way, you have this strong motivation to want to be back with them again. And that doesn't happen because they're dead. They're gone. You can't be near them again in the same way they were when they were alive and physical. So you take all these three things and put the doctrine of the resurrection on it. It doesn't make it easier exactly. That you'll still feel those strong grief circuits. You'll want to be near that person, but at least you can intellectually understand where they are, when you'll see them again, even if that's still a bit nebulous, and that you will one day, like it's not forever, and you could be close to them again. And so,
right. Okay. I do find those brain things fascinating. What you're saying here is that those are the things that work even not in grief. Like let's go ahead and pick my wife. Like right now, I could actually look on my phone and see where she is because we track each other like spies all the time.
Because you're out of control.
I tell you, it's actually really nice. But so we'll have the family sharing, with iPhone.
We do that as well.
We can see where we are. So, but I know like today she had an appointment, and by now I think she's home. But so in my brain, because my wife is someone I have a relationship with, there's these three variables that the brain is actually structured to keep track of. One is thinking, where is she right now? And sure enough, it's interesting you say that because sometimes I'll think of my wife in the middle of the day, and part of my brain is kind of checking off where she is right now. There's that. There's also when I'm going to see her again, because my brain has the register there has a value, which is at the end of the day. I'm expecting to see her again at the end of the day. And then there's something keeping track of the fact that this is my wife and we're very close. We're in love. We're married. So when someone dies, if something were to happen, the natural structure of the brain, those first two things suddenly are thrown out of whack. Where did this person go? Where is this person? Even I think studies of animals kind of show that very thing, that there's a recognition that something isn't there anymore. And if you don't have hope, like you are, if you're atheist and you really do believe that this life is literally all there is, there's nothing more after this, well, then where is that person? That person doesn't even exist anymore. Yeah. But let alone, even if you have this kind of vague in between, it's like, well, but where is the person? The body was buried, but where is the person? And then secondly, when will you see them again? Again, if you're the atheist, never. You will never see this human being ever again. But then also, where is that? Even for these other kind of vague beliefs. But yet, the third component biologically in the brain, that hasn't changed. This is a person who was very close to you. And that conflict in those three, you said it untethers the map or something. Like it leaves us in this state of discombobulation. I get the point that one of the things I appreciate about that, for what we're talking about, is it helps to highlight the way the brain is wired. You are going to grieve in a case like that. You're gonna find grief. In fact, what was it? The famous gorilla who does sign language, Coco, maybe? I'm not sure, something like that. It's a gorilla they taught sign language to. And they'll often want to say, oh, and so it's capable of great thought. But if you really read those studies carefully, it's not. This is not an Einstein amongst animals. However, they say it was a big deal at the time that when Robin Williams died, the animal was sad. It was grieving, where's my friend Robin or something like that. Or they tried to explain that Robin Williams was dead. And so they reported, but still all of that was filtered through the human brain. Whatever the signs that the animal gave, they're all being interpreted by people. And thus you're seeing these more complex layers put on. And yet at the same time, I can imagine that if you can communicate with an animal a certain kind of loss, that something is not present, then the structure of the brain is going to respond in a certain way. But the point is that we seem to be wired to grieve. We seem to be wired to recognize something of value is no longer there.
So by comparison, one of the examples he used was, he said maybe you have like grandparents that live across the country.
Okay.
So you don't see them very often. And so you think, well, isn't that kind of like grief a little bit? He said, you may miss them, but you still know where they are.
Right.
And, and I thought that was actually a good thing to put together. It's not merely that they're out of your sight.
Yeah.
There's a difference with the death.
I could even see that when you're really close with someone, but you've got to be separated for an indeterminate amount of time. And it's painful, especially if you're very close. Maybe it's a best friend. Maybe it is a fiance or something, but work is and so as a result, the relationship is there and you know where they are, but you're still pained by the question mark of when are you actually going to get to see that person again. But then death is kind of the ultimate of taking both of those things away. And yet it is true that we have a hope that others don't have. And so we have answers to those things that others just don't have access to. And they're not the kind of things that we should take advantage of. And you were exactly, at least in my take, Mr. Robinson, I don't know, you don't need my validation, but your focus on why that is, the fact that it's a hope, it's actually made very plain by Paul himself when he says, lest you grieve as others who have no hope. That's the distinction he's making. How we grieve, we should grieve. In fact, if we don't grieve the loss of someone, that would be unusual, right?
Yes.
We'd realize there's something broken in us.
That would actually probably be a legitimate
if it's someone who's truly close to us. And so if we don't grieve, there's something wrong. And sometimes it can take a while to fully, be in that state of grief. But at the same time, we don't grieve as those who don't have a hope. We actually do have a hope of seeing that person again. And so it's a matter of anchoring our grief in that hope and recognizing that hope is a transformative element in our grief. I gave to me, to the extent to which we embrace that hope and we see it and it's real to us, to that extent, our grief is transformed. That's a benefit to the faith that I now hold versus the one I used to have before God opened my mind, because my understanding of what happens after death was extremely fuzzy then. Like I mentioned, the story I made up about my grandfather, versus now, and even more as I age, but not because of age alone, but because I've focused on it, that hope is more real. I've thought about it more. I've read scriptures about it more. The knowledge that what's coming is so transcendent and is so marvelous and is so remarkable. It has transformed. I would say even this recent funeral, Mr. Turner's funeral, I remarked on the fact that I know he is going to be alive again. I know that his eyes closed for the last time in this life, but they are going to open again. And when they open, they're going to open to a world of wonder. They're going to open to seeing Christ, as it says in 1 John 3. And that when he sees Christ in glory, he's going to be in glory. And he's going to see, hopefully, those of us who are there, all of us there as well. And what an amazing source of joy that is. And while it didn't make me not sad, because I'm not going to see him again until that time. It did transform the sadness in a very real way. And I would, if I were, well, because I am, if I were talking to our teens and our young adults about how to get to a place like that, and I'm not saying I'm fully there. I think that the reality of the resurrection is something that should continue to grow in us over time and over the years as we mature. But in terms of how, at least for me, and so this is me speaking just from my personal experience, part of how it has grown, not the whole thing, but part of how it has grown, I feel is also indicated in Paul's words there in 1 Thessalonians, because right after that, when he says he doesn't want us to be ignorant, he doesn't want us to, concerning those who are dead, those who have fallen asleep, he says, lest you sorrow as others who have no hope, for if we believe that Jesus died and rose again, even so, God will bring with him those who sleep in Jesus. It is anchored, and this has grown over my life. My belief in the resurrection is anchored in the fact that I believe Jesus Christ himself died and was rose again. That is a reality. That is what historically happened. It is a fact of history and of reality. And I think Paul anchors it in that too. How did the first, I've heard apologists try to explain, and I mean mainstream apologists, try to explain how was it this first century church in this weird little group in Judaism, who suddenly, well, I say Judaism, but first century beliefs, what energized that group? Because they were adopting ideas that the Jews at the time did not hold. The idea that this is just some branch of the Jews at the time, no, they had radically different ideas. And among those radically different ideas was the idea of a personal resurrection in a way that was not quite
Right.
what the Jews believed at the time. And this idea, and they say, well, the easiest explanation is because this is what they saw in Jesus. They literally saw a man, they knew him, they touched him, he preached to them, he told them, I'm going to die and I'm going to be resurrected.
They witnessed his death.
They witnessed his death. There was no doubt that this was a dead man. And then there was no doubt that he was alive again.
Man, what a great point. And it would be easy. I'm glad you've made this point, because it would be easy to overlook this and just focus on, having hope in the resurrection and not going deeper on it, because it really hit me how much I've underestimated how many of the Jews don't actually have a doctrine of a resurrection or don't even know what happens when you die. And it hit me when I was listening to Ben Shapiro, that most people will know is Jewish, and Dennis Prager, who's Jewish, and they're talking to each other. And Ben Shapiro asked Dennis Prager, he goes, what's your best scripture that you think brings out that there's an idea of a resurrection? Because they don't feel like that's really baked into the Old Testament. There are some scriptures that are more obvious than others in the Old Testament, but especially if you limit it to the first 5 books of the Bible, they really feel like there's no talk of an afterlife, really.
Right, it's what Jesus had to kind of he kind of revealed that there was, because they missed it.
Yeah, you're right, and I never really had thought of it actually about how much of a radical message that was at the time, that you have a personal resurrection, so much so that Paul cleverly used that when he was on trial and said something about the Sadducees are judging me because of the
belief in the resurrection.
Belief in the resurrection, and it was mayhem. But
he was pretty savvy.
Also, Paul also said that you made me think of this when you read that, and the focus on the hope because of Christ rose. He says later, if there is no hope in the resurrection, we're all men most pitiable. It's like we're kind of wasting our time, trying to be good in a way.
That's right.
If there's no resurrection. And he's exactly right. The key point being, look, if this is all a hoax and Christ died and wasn't resurrected, then neither will we be. But,
exactly.
Yeah.
It is absolutely central. If Christ didn't rise, then your faith, my faith, it's all a joke. Mm-hmm. This is nonsense. But and I talk about this in a sermon. We'll try to link to a few sermons on the livingyouth.org website, which we encourage you to go visit, which is the natural native home of the podcast, livingyouth.org. But there's a sermon I gave, What If the Resurrection is Real? And that was part of what I wanted to focus on, was this idea that, if it didn't happen, then all this is a waste of time. All this is a lie. But if it did happen, it literally transforms every single facet of life. There's nothing about our personal lives. There's nothing about society. There's nothing about human history that is untouched by the fact of Christ resurrected. It's what validates a coming kingdom.
Yep.
It's what puts all of the history of mankind in perspective. It changes science, philosophy, religion, history. Everything is affected by the fact of Christ's resurrection, and that's our hope. And so when Peter wrote, one of my I'd say favorite verse is probably the wrong way to put it. One of my motivating verses is in 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 15. And in fact, let me turn there. I didn't actually have that pulled up. But in 1 Peter...
So while you're looking that up,
yeah,
it sounds to me like Christ is a very central figure here in the Bible. Mr. Gwynn used to... I loved how he would summarize very succinctly, like, the Bible at times. And he would point out, this is an oversimplification, of course, but like the entire Old Testament pointed towards Christ's ministry. This is kind of one of the big points, Hey, actually, this hasn't worked out so great. So what's the solution? Well, the solution is Christ. And the four gospel accounts are kind of like the fulcrum. They're the pivot point of humanity that goes on. And I thought that was such a good way of putting it. And everything does point towards Christ. And when he comes, then that's kind of highlight. Another philosopher, whose name I can't mention, thought he loved the idea. First, Christ comes and kind of lays out the way of life you're supposed to live, and then comes 2,000 years later and wants to know what did we do about it? Coming as a judge, and that made perfect sense to him.
That's interesting.
I thought that was also a good way of.
Oh, it is. Okay, I found it in 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 15. Peter says, "But sanctify the Lord God in your hearts, and always be ready to give a defense to everyone who asks you a reason for the hope that is in you with meekness and fear."
That's a good one.
Oh, yeah, it's very motivating for me. And others talk about other translations say give an answer. The word there is defense or answer, regardless. And that's where we get the word apologetics, by the way. Sometimes people hear apologetics and think it's about apologizing. Yeah. But it's apologetics is from the Greek here of the word that's translated defense and this idea of giving a defense, because it has to do with speaking logically. However, we often, and it's not wrong to say this, so just so you know, I'm not saying it's wrong. It's not wrong to say this, that we talk about it when people want to explain your faith, or they want you to explain your belief, right? Like you defend yourself. And so no, it's definitely that, but let's not miss what he says. He says very specifically, always be ready to give a defense to everyone who asks you a reason for the hope that is in you. And of course, not to be cocky about it, do it with meekness and fear, he says, just, have a humble spirit. But the fact is, the hope should be alive in us to such an extent that not every day, maybe not all the time, even though it's always there, it's always changing something in you, but there's times when it really stands out. And actually, when it comes to death and dealing with the reality of that is one of those times where that hope does stand out. Right. And it's meant to be a hallmark such that occasionally people will just wonder, why are you not taking this in the same way the rest of us are? What's different about that?
And you know what? Because I know it's intimidating. Like my younger daughter Ella had a coffee barista job, and it was just a small little family-run business. And they knew that Ella had some different beliefs, and they asked her about them one time. And so she, for the first time in her life, had to explain a little bit about unleavened bread. And she was telling me about it. She was a mix of, I hope I did a good job, but kind of excited that she survived her first time. She had to kind of explain something. But even if you're very young, you have the answers whether you realize it or not. If somebody asked you, I thought maybe you'd be a little bit sadder, and you had to respond, what could you say? Well, if you explain to them your belief, it would be, well, right now they're at rest, and they're not even aware. I don't know if you go into this level of detail, but to just re-summarize, they're asleep right now. They're at rest. They're at peace. They're not suffering, and they're waiting for the return of Christ, and they'll be resurrected, and they'll have a spirit body where they're not. The pain is gone. You and I were in your office the other day, and we were kind of talking about this because everybody out there could think about a loved one maybe they've lost that they know that was suffering, and to go just to think. I like how you put it earlier. They close their eyes. They're not going to be aware of the passage of time. They don't feel anything. And then next time they open their eyes, it's going to be as like an instant to them.
Right.
To Mr. Turner, he's going to be, what happened? And the next thing he knows, he's rising from his grave and to eternal glory and everything that pictures. And that really hit me because that's personal to every single one of us, you and I aren't getting any younger, and we're closer to the end of our life than the beginning of our life. But to think the peace that it brings me. Do we fear death? Are we looking for death? No. Would we try to avoid dying if we could? Yes.
And if I were to hear I was about to die, I'd be scared if I saw a car, something.
100%.
Right.
But at the same time, not super concerned about it.
That's not the greatest aspect. That's 100%, Mr. Robinson. That's exactly right. That's part of what I hope comes across is essentially the central theme of all of this, is that Paul says the hope we have is transformative in such a way that things are different for us. And I so appreciate Mr. Robinson's thinking about that in terms of from a young person's perspective, like what Ella had to go through. I hope out there that you see questions like that not as something to shirk away from, and they can be intimidating, I know, but kind of get used to it. Your beliefs are going to make you stand out in the world. It's going to be unavoidable in some circumstances, and to a certain extent, man, that's what we're called to do. We're called to stand out from the rest of the world. I like to get poetic about it. As the sky grows darker, the stars stand out. And there's a brightness that God has given you in this beautiful, astonishing hope. And so don't be afraid when those times come where you're asked to give an answer. Be excited about that. Be excited that, and Jesus even says, hey, don't worry too much about what you got to say. Pray about it and I'll help you give an answer. But at the same time, that doesn't mean we can't fill ourselves with the truth. In fact, if I were going to give you a concrete recommendation in terms of preparing yourself for those times, I would say this is the time to solidify yourself in this hope, to actually talk to your parents about it. What were those moments when this hope really bolstered them and really raised them up? And what were the things that they thought of, perhaps when their parents died, or if they knew the truth when their grandparents died? And so keep those things in mind. And to bring it back to Christ, as Mr. Robinson said, guess what? He really is the center of all of this. And I would encourage you as a young person, and I wish I had pursued this knowledge even harder when I was younger, to try to make as real as you can the resurrection of Jesus Christ. That this is what we believe. We believe that a man predicted his own death and then died and then eventually walked out of that tomb alive again. And I have a sermon on that, I suppose. I didn't look that one up. I can't think of the name of that, but I think it's called Did He Rise? I think that's the title. But the point is, the historical facts are there, and these are things that even atheistic scholars agree. Not there's almost nothing in the world that every single person agrees on. However, there are a lot of even atheistic scholars that agree. Jesus was a preacher at the time. He did talk about these things. He was crucified. He was buried. And literally all of his disciples shortly after said they saw him alive again. And it was not like a normal kind of hallucination. Right. It was the kind of thing that they have yet to come up with a good explanation for.
Yeah, and I remember that one. And you talk about how if it was all just some elaborate hoax, eventually, nobody clings to something like that for the whole rest of their life. And they all almost all of them died. They were martyred, I think.
They were martyred when they just had to recant, just to recant. And no, they either chose to be tortured to death for a lie, or they chose to be tortured to death because on the other side of that torture was the glory they saw in the living Christ.
So good.
And so, the resurrection transforms everything, and it transforms our relationship to grief. It's not that we don't grieve, but as Paul said, we do not grieve as others do who have no hope, because we do have hope.